It's possibly the bulkiest because of the very beautiful formatting of the text. There's normally publishers squeeze as much words as they can onto a page, and that wasn't done here. It's quite a lovely production. So what I want to talk about is, to some extent, the book itself. After 17 years, I decided to write it because I could feel in the middle of the telecommunications bubble and the dot-com bubble at the end of the 1990s that there was probably going to be a financial crisis in the early 2000s. I didn't think it would necessarily be a terminal one for capitalism, but it would be a substantial one. And I knew also that there was no chance of persuading the public that there was something seriously wrong with economic theory unless there was a crisis. Because a bit like if you're driving a car, you don't really care how the engine works until it stops working. And the same thing for the public in general. There are people like myself who are fascinated by economics, just like there are mechanics who are fascinated by cars. But nobody else wants to hear us talk unless the system we're supposed to be managing breaks down. So I wrote the first edition with an expectation that there'd be a crisis, and there was a mild one in 2000 because, as it happened, the private debt bubble that was causing the dot-com crisis, as that was breaking and coming down, and we had the collapse of the Nasdaq index in 2001, at the same time the subprime bubble was taking over. So the actual change in leverage and credit driving the economy in America only dropped very slightly, and then it went racing off until the crisis in 2007. So the intriguing thing for me was to look and see, one of the many intriguing things was to see just how neoclassical literature had changed over time. So that's the first edition. That was published in, I think, in April of 2001. I'm not sure, but about April. And in that same time, you had, and I called it at the time, the naked emperor of the social sciences. A few reasons for that. One, I think it's a classically accurate description of what mainstream economics is. It looks extremely elaborate, or it thinks it looks elaborate, but it's effectively naked. But also there was a wonderful article by Alan Kerman published about 10 years earlier reacting to one of the serious mathematical flaws in mainstream economics and saying the emperor has no clothes. So I thought that was a good reason to steal it. But at the same time as I was writing a critical overview of neoclassical economics, they were becoming what's been called triumphalist. They thought they'd conquered not just their rivals in economics, the only ones they really knew about were the Marxists, I think, but they also thought they'd conquered capitalism as well, in that they thought they knew how to manage it. So Ed Lazaire, who's a very nice guy, by the way, I've met Ed, I like him. I'm not criticising these as people, they're good people. They genuinely believe they're doing good, and that's one of the reasons they're so dangerous. The most dangerous person you can meet is somebody who sincerely believes they're doing you good while they're killing you. Okay? But Ed wrote this paper called Economic Imperialism in the early 2000s, and he said it's a genuine science. And some of the points he emphasised about it being scientific are things which critics have been saying it's why it's fanciful, it's mythical. So rational individuals who engage in maximising behaviour, we can talk about that later in discussion, but he saw that as an essential reason why they were superior to other social sciences, not just other schools of thought within economics. By this stage they'd ignored that there are any other approaches to economics. It's other social sciences like sociology. Are sociologists scientists? Well, they don't really think people do maximising behaviour, therefore sociologists are not scientists. That sort of thinking. Models adhere strictly to the importance of equilibrium as a part of any theory. So equilibrium plays a key role, and he thought that's what makes something scientific. Clearly, of course, Newton worried about equilibrium. Let's talk about that later. And then a focus on efficiency. So those things he saw as the reason that economics was not just a science, but it was the only social science, and it should take over all the others, and everything is wonderful for economics. Now, of course, 2007 came along, and Ed Lazaire, for his sins, by this stage, was the chief economic advisor of G.W. Bush. So he was in the hot seat when the crisis hit. And I think there's a certain amount of justice to that. Now, of course, Then after the crisis hit, and the crisis, as you've heard, that I was one of a handful of economists who warned about it, but I'm not about to claim that we were the only ones who saw it coming. It took doing a mainstream economics degree not to see that there was a crisis approaching. Any person with any feel for financial markets or looking at speculation or worrying about irrational behaviour was worried about 2007. Only economists thought in general it was going to be a great year, with the exception of people like myself and Wolfram here and others who say, sorry, this is a mythical theory. If you think everything is great, we're in deep trouble. So in 2010 I wrote a wrap-up, and the difference between, if I can steal that one, between this edition, oh, hang on, got the wrong one, where's the other one? The old one. No, not yours. The 2000, you had the 2001?
No.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, pardon me. Okay, my mistake. This is the 2010 edition, which has been translated here. The difference between this and the previous one in terms of content is that I did a lot more work on macroeconomics here. Macroeconomics and finance. That was the major expansion that I did. Now, by the time the crisis came, of course, it was in the aftermath of the crisis when it came out. And Ben Bernanke, another person who deserves to have been in the hot seat when the crisis struck, of course, the chairman of the Federal Reserve when the crisis struck, looking at the implication of the crisis for economics, he said, well, standard models didn't predict the crisis, which is true, and they can't incorporate financial instability. Now, that, if you were genuinely a scientist, that would be a good reason to say, let's try to find another theory. What does he say next? Do they mean the theory is flawed? And his answer was, it's a qualified no. Now, why is it a no? He said it's no because models are useful for the context in which they're designed. These models were designed when instability isn't an issue, and they were quite good when there was nothing wrong. That's, to me, that's a bit like saying we've got a fabulous map that's really good if you go in a straight line. If you turn a corner, you're in your own problem. We've designed a map for straight roads. Useless. But that's the sort of justification. Now, partly, and I've learned a lot of this by talking to neoclassical economists, again, who say most are very nice people. Some aren't, but most of them are very nice people. And I would give a talk about how there'd be tendencies for crises and herd behaviour and so on. And I had quite a few come up and say, look, you just don't understand that what we're talking about is people don't make systematic errors. That's all we're saying. People learn from their mistakes. They make an error, they'll adjust for it the next time. All we're saying is they won't make systematic errors. Well, neoclassical economists have been making systematic errors now for a decade. Because every year, and you'll see this in OECD reports and IMF reports and Federal Reserve reports and so on, they predicted a return to 4% or 3% rate of economic growth. And they've been consistently wrong for 10 years. And I think that, more than the financial crisis, has started to make them think there's something seriously wrong with our models. It's not just that they're not good for the times of financial instability, they're clearly not working after a crisis either. So you now find there's a series of translations that have come out of my book. I don't think that's played a role in the move they've gone through, but they've started to say we have to revise our theory quite substantially. And I think what I might, if I do write a third edition, and I'm now seriously considering doing that, but not till 2021, I might call it The Naked Emperor Abdicates, because the previous edition was called, you can't see from here, but it says The Naked Emperor Dethroned. Okay? And the crisis dethroned them. But by 2016, this thing we were giving up. Now, Koshal Akoti, you might not know the name, but he was the president of the Minneapolis branch of the Federal Reserve. So he's one of the 13 people who gets to decide whether interest rates rise or fall every 3 months at the Federal Reserve. And the Minneapolis branch, which he was president of, was the most economically conservative branch. So there's two broad divisions to mainstream macroeconomics. There's what they call the saltwater crowd, who generally come from universities on the coast of America, Paul Krugman, Ben Bernanke, people like that, Olivia Blanchard, and they believe that you have imperfections that slow down the rate at which a capitalist economy will return to equilibrium after a shock. But you also have what they call the freshwater group. And the freshwater economists believe the economy is always in equilibrium. And when you have a serious decline in employment, that's because there's been a change in the labour-leisure trade-off that people do. So because of some, what they call preference shock or technology shock, people decide to work less because they're going to work more in the future. So they take a vacation now, and the vacation statisticians mistakenly call the vacations Great Depressions. I'd like to be joking, by the way, but I'm not. I can quote you papers that literally say that. But Koshler-Kotter was part of that extreme group, and then the experience of all this last decade of not seeing where the crisis came from and then getting wrong the predictions of return to equilibrium. He came out with this beautiful paper, just a simple 2-page note I think it was, at a National Bureau of Economic Research seminar, and said we simply do not have a successful settled theory of the macroeconomy. We just don't know how it works, which I think is, it takes bravery to say that. I wish these people would say it while they're still in power. Koshler-Kotter has now retired from the Federal Reserve, but that's what he had to say. Paul Romer. Now, Paul Romer has just recently become chief economist for the World Bank, and there's all sorts of dramas going inside the World Bank, as I understand, because he's upsetting their mainstream economists to some extent. But he said in 2016, for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. And what he wrote in that paper is the sort of thing I would write, in terms of his tone and satire of the theory. I really do recommend reading that paper. It's called The Trouble with Macroeconomics, and you can find it just by searching for his name and trouble on the internet. And finally, Olivia Blanchard, who was a great fan, a great builder of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models when he was chief economist for the International Monetary Fund. In fact, I know I had a student apply to do a PhD with me, and he said, I want to build a DSG model of my economy, which happened to be Gambia. And I said, well, I'm not going to supervise that. I think that's a waste of time. I will not supervise you doing a DSG model. Why do you want to do a DSG model? He said, because I work for the Central Bank of Gambia, and we've been told by the IMF if we want to have discussions with the IMF, we must have a DSG model of Gambia. That was required by Olivia Blanchard, so I believe. I'll check with him later. But that's how much dominance he had in saying we have to do these very neoclassical models of the economy. But now he's saying they're based on unappealing assumptions, not merely ones that are simplifying, and you have to have, and I agree, simplifying assumptions, but ones which are false, categorically contradict reality. No, you're not making a simplifying assumption of saying 80% of people like Pepsi Cola and 20% like Coke, so we're going to assume all cola is Pepsi. It's saying no, 90% of people like Coke and 10% like Pepsi, so we're going to assume all Coke is Pepsi. Ignore the 90%. There's no big difference there, but that's effectively what neoclassical economists do, is make an assumption which contradicts empirical data. Not that it simplifies and removes nuances, it contradicts. But here he's saying, and this is something I agree with, we need to have some core of doing economics we all agree with. He said it's a pipe dream, might be a pipe dream, but it's worth pursuing. Now he then said, well, if so, what we did to build DSG models is correct. And the reason is, he says, where else can you start from but microeconomics? That's why I've crossed that line out. He's wrong. I want to show you why he's wrong in a moment. You can start from elsewhere and have an agreed foundation that nobody can criticise. I want to show you how to do that. So what I'll be doing if I write the 3rd edition, I won't be diving straight into critique, because when I wrote the 1st edition, I had to assume people had done a mainstream neoclassical economics degree. They might not have even known it was neoclassical. People often just learn economics and think it's just economics. But I had to say, this is what you believe, and this is why you're wrong. Now, instead, I'm going to say, well, you know you're wrong. I want to explain why you're wrong. So what you think are unappealing assumptions really are unappealing because they're false. So, for example, you will be learning, if you're doing a first-year microeconomics course, or if you've done one, that marginal costs rise with output. No, they do not. 95% of firms report falling marginal costs with increasing output. the highest survey of any. There have been about between 30 and 50 survey articles surveying firms asking what are their cost structures. Every last one has found the majority of firms have declining marginal costs. Within the survey, the maximum percentage of firms that reported rising marginal costs was 11%. The other 89% said constant or falling. Normally, in most of the surveys, the answers are 5% have rising cost, 95% have falling. So if you want to simplify, what you do is you ignore the ones that have got rising marginal cost. And you build a theory of how firms behave, assuming declining marginal cost, leaving out the slight curly bit that some firms report rising marginal cost. But if you look, for example, at the latest mainstream economic textbook, which is produced by Wendy Carlin and Diane Coyle and a few others, and it's called the Core textbook, that still assumes rising marginal cost. It ignores all these empirical studies. I've had enough of that. I'm going for the jugular over this stuff. I had a chapter in the book which you'll see called No More Mr. Nice Guy. I'm going to be Mr. Arsehole over this. I'm not going to let them get away with pretending that costs rise. It's fallacy. If you're going to simplify and ignore the firms that report rising marginal cost, build a theory on falling marginal cost. Utility maximising consumers. There have been numerous attempts to model this. Only one of the papers actually makes any real empirical sense. My favourite one that doesn't make empirical sense was a study of inmates in a mental asylum to work out whether they're rational or not. Let that sink in. Okay? But the best one is done by a German economist called Sippel. And he found that working with university students, you'd have to assume they're highly intelligent, highly motivated because they were paid to take part in the study. The goods they chose in a set of choices between different patterns, they actually got to consume one of those choices. So this is all stuff they were really motivated with a simple toy model with 8 commodities to maximise their utility. They objectively did not. According to the neoclassical theory, 95% of these highly educated, highly intelligent people were irrational. They were not utility maximising. The whole idea is a toy model. It simply doesn't scale beyond a piece of paper. It looks convincing when you draw a nice smooth curve on a 2-dimensional sheet where the curve has a tangent to a straight line budget line. That's easy. You try doing that in 30-dimensional hyperspace. Okay? That's what you do when you go inside a tiny shop. If you go inside a supermarket, you're working inside a 10,000 dimensional space. You try drawing a curve in a straight line for that. Capitalism is barter. Now again, mainstream economics ignores banking, ignores debt, ignores money. This is the remarkable thing for somebody who hasn't done an economics degree. Most of them think economists are experts on money. No, they're not. They're experts on dreaming up reasons why you don't need to analyse money in building models of the economy. Now, I believe that takes genuine expertise. It takes somebody really clever to make as stupid an assumption as that and build something that looks like a model of capitalism. But that's what they do. We know that there was no period in human history where barter was a dominant form of transactions. Anthropologists have checked a range of naturalist societies, hundreds of papers. They've found 2 or 3 instances of individuals bartering, never inside one of those communities. It's always between communities, and it's highly ritualised. It's the sort of thing done in such a way as to prevent war breaking out between neighbouring tribes. It is not by any stretch the way any human society has ever done transactions, and yet we model that as if it fits 21st century capitalism. Garbage. Now the main thing I want to talk about in terms of a technical thing today is the belief you must derive macro from micro. Macroeconomics is the holy grail of economic theory. It's the foundation of utility maximising individuals, profit maximising firms. That's the vision that economists always retreat to when their attempts to apply that to the macroeconomy collapse. So that's what they think you should build all economics on. Now, we know from what's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de-Boer theorem that you can't derive even a single market demand curve from the model of a single consumer, because the theory leaves out the distribution of income. But when you change prices and you change relative prices, you change incomes. When you change incomes, then your distribution of income changes, and therefore your demand curve changes and doesn't go down, it might go up. So we know they can't even drive a market demand curve. And the final point, which I'll talk about a bit as well, it's getting fairly technical here, is you can't produce anything without energy. But it's not just neoclassical economists who are guilty here. All schools of economic thought have built models of production that assumes labour and capital alone can produce output. They can't. So we have incredibly inadequate theories of the social system in which we live, and we need to get decent ones. Now, so that'll be a positive agenda. It won't just be debunking, it'll be trying to rebuild economics. And I want to show you why it has to start from, not from micro, but it actually start from macro itself. You can derive macroeconomics from macro definitions. You don't need micro at all. Let's imagine you define the level of number of people with a job and the wages share of GDP, and then define that's the employment rate and the wages share. And if I add in productivity, which is how many units of output are there per worker, and profit, which is how much is left over after you pay wages, then I get these basic five definitions, the final one being the rate of profit. So those are all definitions, just looking at them. That's the employment rate, is how many people have a job divided by population. You can't disagree with that. Okay? It's a definition. Wages, the wages share is wage bill divided by GDP. This is not stuff you can disagree with. Labour productivity, number of units of output divided by how many workers there are. Profit, output minus wages. Profit rate, profit divided by GDP, which ends up being the opposite of wages share. So that's quite simple. I've got one little error there I've just noticed. I'll fix that. That's the profit share, not the profit rate, but I'll fix it up later. So let's just work from that. With that definition, and this is going to be fairly hard to read, that's starting by the definition. If I differentiate that with respect to time, I'm differentiating a quotient rule. So if I expand it out like so, I now have 1 over the population level times the rate of change of employment minus the employment rate multiplied by this factor, which is the rate of growth of population. And this one, L, I can substitute output divided by labour productivity. So if I do that, and there, then I get this new equation, where I've now got the rate of growth of population turning up as part of the argument. Now, expanding that out again the same way, what I have here is, I'll just go backwards one. What I've got here is the rate of growth of labour productivity. So I'm substituting that. And over here, I've got a complicated expression including the rate of change of GDP, labour divided by GDP, and the population rate as well. I can substitute all that for saying that's the employment rate times economic growth. So I've now got an expression which is it's just still a definition. That's why I've got the 3-line definitional sign rather than just the equal sign. The rate of change of employment will be the employment rate multiplied by rate of economic growth minus productivity growth and population growth. So my final expression is quite simple. The employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of population and labour productivity growth. Now that's not a model. That's a factual statement, put now not as a definition now, but as a function of time. If I did the same thing for wages share of GDP, I won't take you through the maths of deriving it, but I get a very similar expression. Wages share of output will rise if wage rises exceed the growth in labour productivity. Now those are two undeniably true statements. To make it into a model, what I've got to do is add assumptions. You can't avoid assumptions. But one thing which you learn from complex systems analysis is it's not the assumptions itself that generate the behaviour of the model, it's the structure of the model. And the simplest possible assumptions can lead you a large way towards understanding the system. So I'm going to assume that output is simply a linear function of how many machines there are. A very simple assumption. I've incorporated energy, but I won't take you through that in this particular model. I'm going to assume that investment's a linear function of the rate of profit. So the higher the rate of profit, the more firms wish to invest. The lower the rate of profit, the less they wish to invest. They might even disinvest. And wage demands are a linear function of the employment rate. So those are those assumptions. That's the there's output as a linear function of capital, investment depending upon the rate of profit. Those are those equations over here. So there's the rate of profit gives you a straight line relationship between investment as a percentage of GDP and a wage share is a straight line function depending upon the employment rate. I put that together. I'm starting to get messy in algebra terms here, and I'm happy to leave the slides behind for anybody who wants to take it through in a hurry, but rather less of a hurry. But that's saying the rate of change of employment will be the employment rate multiplied by investment divided by the capital output ratio minus the sum of changes in labour productivity, population growth rate and depreciation. Now that's a very simple looking model. If I model it, if I actually run that model, so if I can bring up the software here, this is my program I call Minsky. I get a model that gives you cyclical behaviour. In other words, the belief that there's an equilibrium here. It's right in the middle of that. If I go here and take a look, I caused it to crash by pressing the wrong mouse button. Let's go back and try that again. This is a beta release of the software, so it's somewhat unstable. This is a model that's inherently cyclical. I'm paying a real price for using a beta version, pardon me. I'll load the release version, which will work better. So it's an inherently cyclical model. The equilibrium of this model is neutral. It neither attracts nor repels. If we're in this model forever, it'll continue giving cycles. You don't need equilibrium to analyse a system. Okay? It's a property of a model. It is not where the model ends up being. So that's the classic instance of a non-equilibrium system. And that's starting straight from macro. So the very first model you get gives you non-equilibrium behaviour. Now, to go to the next stage, I add private debt. And I redefine profit now as being net not just of wages but also of interest payments. And that very simply says the debt ratio will rise if debt rises faster than GDP. Again, obviously a factual statement, not a model. So to make it into a model, I assume that debt is used to finance investment when investment exceeds retained earnings. That gives me one more set of equations. And I finally end up with that expression. So I now add that to the model. And what I get is something which, again, is outside the purview of mainstream economics. There's mainstream models with thousands of equations. Okay? But they almost universally do. They linearise everything. They remove nonlinear relationships. Now here, I've got the employment rate multiplied by a function that includes the wages share and the debt level. So there's inherent nonlinearities. All the assumptions I made are linear assumptions, but the structure is nonlinear. So if you run that model, this is the sort of behaviour you get. And I'm going to change one part of the model. There's a little element there that got put in for the wrong reason. This is the rate at which capitalists wish to invest. How aggressive are capitalists in desiring to invest? And you clearly want capitalists who really want to invest money. You want to have high animal spirits, not low. If you have low animal spirits, this model converges to an equilibrium. So it's got a stable equilibrium with a low level of desire to invest by capitalists. But if I change that and I say let's have more aggressive capitalists, what you'd actually want to have, then it appears to stabilise. Notice the cycles are getting smaller in this graph, which is graphing the wages share against the employment rate. And that's clearly a faster convergence to equilibrium than in the previous simulation I showed you. But keep on going, look what happens. You get a rise in volatility, a decline in their rise. Now I built this model with nonlinear functions back in 1992. So I predicted the Great Moderation before it happened. And that's why I was very cynical when mainstream economists are saying how great it was to have the Great Moderation. To me that was a warning sign, not something to be pleased about. So we get this emergent properties happening. Out of a very simple model, we get stuff which is a complete conundrum for the mainstream, which drops out of an incredibly simple model. For a start, diminishing cycles followed by rising cycles, which is what we went through from 1992 until 2008. Increasing income equality. Workers are getting less, bankers are getting more. Workers' share is falling, bankers' share is rising. That's a class-based explanation for increasing inequality, which we know is empirically the fact. And they all drop out of an incredibly simple model, which is derived from macroeconomics directly, not by starting with fictional ideas about microeconomics. Now, you get the basic idea of a distribution of income turning up. You get a rising debt ratio, causing rising inequality. So capitalists, as it happens, don't see this coming. They tend to have a fairly constant share of profit until the crisis hits. Bankers are smiling through the whole thing because they're getting more money. Okay. Most people in the City of England are very happy. And workers are complaining because they're getting less and less and less. And that's what we've seen in the real world. So if I, again, simulate this in a more complicated model now, this is a model that includes price dynamics. This is only the second stage model, by the way. The first stage has linear relationships and no price dynamics. This has linear or non-linear relationships and price dynamics. It's still an incredibly simple model. But if I simulate this model, I get what looks like stability followed by crash, which is what we went through. And we came out of it because of government spending. So that's a more complicated, more advanced model, but still incredibly simple compared to what could be done with this modelling approach in future. So, for example, I can include the government having counter-cyclical spending. I've done that back in 1992, and I'll show that if anybody wants to see that later. And I also want to have multiple sectors rather than a single commodity abstraction, and I want to have multiple countries. So all that is feasible to build in this approach. We don't have to start at microeconomics. It's a bad policy choice by neoclassicals to start there. So what's actually going on? How do you understand what I've shown you there? Because it is counterintuitive that if capitalists want to invest more, you have a crisis. Okay? What's actually going on? Well, capitalism is a profit-driven system, and the rate of investment depends upon the rate of profit. And profit is net of what you've got after you've paid wages and paid the interest bill. So investment, if it takes off, will lead to rising debt because you're financing that investment by borrowing more money. This is not Ponzi behaviour, by the way. This is genuinely building factories. Okay? That's why I've had a querulous reaction to saying just make sure there's no bad lending and everything will be fine. Even with lending that builds factories, specifically as capitalists wish to have, you can still have a crisis. That was Minsky's point as well. So the increasing amount of investment causes a boom. The boom causes and is financed by a rising share going to bankers. And at the end of the boom, workers finally get enough bargaining power to start demanding wage rises as well. So if bankers' share rises and workers' share rises, guess who finally, at the peak of the boom, starts to lose out? Capitalists get less profit. That means they're less motivated to invest. They stop investing and a slump begins. The slump will end when a falling amount going to workers and a slightly smaller amount going to bankers restores the initial distribution of income, so capitalists are once again getting a level of profit that will encourage them to invest as much as they want. But in that situation, there'll be a higher, because there's more debt, there'll be a higher amount going to workers and a smaller amount going to bankers. Now I'm going to annoy some people in the room here when I point out the first person to actually pick up this dynamic was a bloke called Carl in 1867. Okay? Because when he wrote the foundation of this model verbally back in 1867, in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, he finished up with this little line. Put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent variable. The rate of wages is the dependent variable. Now, he never managed to put it in mathematics himself, but he's right. So the workers in this system are the ones who end up paying for the increasing debt. Even though the workers aren't doing the borrowing, they pay by getting a smaller share of income over time. So that's a realistic place to start macro, but it's still not enough. I believe we went astray not from Adams, not from Marx or even from Volra. I think economics went astray with Adam Smith. This is Adam Smith's belief that the annual labour of every nation is what supplies us with the goods and services that we call wealth. I've struck through it because I think that's wrong. The person who got it right preceded Adam Smith by 10 years, Richard Cantillon, who was part of the physiocratic school based in France. He was actually Irish but living in France and being a French bureaucrat at the time. He says land is the source. Land's the source of all value. And he's right, because what the land does is absorb energy, and we then convert the energy into something else. Now, we've had theories of production, not just the neoclassicals but also post-Keynesians, where energy plays no role. This is the insight that made me realise the nonsense behind that. Labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. So you have to see them as means of harnessing energy. You can't produce anything. This is the Cobb-Douglas reduction function, saying output is something, some disembodied labour productivity, technical change, times capital raised to one exponent times labour to 1 minus the exponent. No role for energy. What you can actually say is, however output is produced, what's going on is labour is capturing energy and harnessing it to do work, and machinery is doing the same thing, and output is fundamentally useful work. So I spell that out in a bit more detail. I can now say that total GDP is a function of the number of workers times the amount of energy they consume, times how much that energy is available, the proportion of energy available to do real work, times how efficiently it's done. And for machinery, I can just say it's the amount of energy consumed by a machine times how much is needed to keep the machine going times its efficiency. And when I put that in terms of output per head and in terms of the population rate, I get an expression where it says this output per head is a function of the employment rate times energy per head times the efficiency with which that work is done. And fitting this to the data, this is GDP per capita in America, the nice upward trend that they like seeing, except for the downturn in 2008, then back on trend again, but not returning to the previous trend level. This is the employment rate, which in America actually peaked in 2000. We think America's recovered after the financial crisis, but in terms of the employment rate, it's still, 2% below the employment rate that it reached before the crisis hit back in 2007, and 4% below the employment rate it had back in 2000. Who do you reckon voted for Trump? People that America's not counting. Strangely enough, I got quite a shock when I saw this. Energy per head in America peaked back in 1978. It's declined since then. So the only way I can explain why we've had increasing output across that time is twofold. One, workers have been getting less, which we know is true. But secondly, energy efficiency must have risen as well. Of course, the oil shocks of 73 and 79 would have played a factor in that. But that's per capita energy output. Now, that made it quite challenging to wonder whether my equation would fit the data well, but in fact it does fit the data quite well, better than a Cobb-Douglas production function does do. So we look at GDP change and change in the equation I showed you. I fit the data quite tightly. The red line is change in GDP, the blue line is change in the energy per capita equation I showed you a moment ago. And the final bit, I know I'm making you're going to need a fair bit of vodka after this, I'm afraid to say. A lot of topics being covered in one lecture. But the final thing is what to do about money. And I know this is a major factor for Poland because over dinner last night and over, 2 scotches? Okay. Marson told me your government has a rule and it's aping. You're deciding to penalise yourself as if you remember the European Union before you actually join. Okay, I think that's like you might call Polish flagellation. Okay, you're deciding to whip yourself before the European Union whips you instead. So the rule you've taken is government debt cannot exceed 60% of GDP. Okay? And the whole idea is you should save money. And this is Theresa May, or the Maybot, as she's known affectionately in Britain these days, saying Britain must live within its means. Okay? And the whole idea is here that everybody should spend less than they earn. Isn't that a great idea? We should all save money. So what we've got in mind is that you have it's just called Sector A, it can be anything at all. In year 0, Sector A spends £200 or €200 or 200 zlotsky and earns 200, so makes 0 savings. And the next year they spend 10 less, still the same income, they save 10. Great idea. Let's all do it. Okay. I've got pounds there because I gave this presentation first in Britain. I apologise for that. I don't know what the symbol is for the zlotsky. So you're putting £10 away for an extra day. Let's all try doing it. So what happens to sector B and C? Let's divide the economy into 3 arbitrary sectors. Could be government, services, manufacturing, government, finance, non-finance, anything you like. It could be government, non-government, foreign sector. What actually happens? Well, Sector A, remember, is spending in year 0 200. Let's say it spends 100 in Sector B and 100 in Sector C. Then it spends 190 the year after, which means it's spending 95 less on Sector B and Sector C. So Sector A saves 10, but if Sector B and C are still spending as much, they're going to save -5. Okay. So the savings of Sector A turn up as a fall in income for sectors B and C. Your saving is somebody else's fall in income because expenditure is income. What you spend becomes somebody else's income. If you spend less, somebody else earns less. So it doesn't look so great at the macro level anymore, does it? There's dis-saving going on of £5 each for each of the other 2 sectors, not because they're irresponsible, it's because the behaviour of Sector A caused the decline in the income of B and C. And the problem is, living within your means spending less than you earn. But in the aggregate level, expenditure is income. They cannot be different. So if you try to spend less than you earn, what you do is reduce income. And this is a route to 0 income. Attempting to save money at the aggregate level will lead to a GDP of 0 and no savings. Let's take a look at it. Let's say all sectors, we start with £600 per year GDP because each sector is earning 200 and spending 200 and there are 3 sectors. So we start from here. Notice the diagonal sums to 600 negative, that's spending going out, and the off diagonal sum to 600 positive, that's income. This is what I call an expenditure income table. They are necessarily equal. So sector A is the first one to attempt to save. And what happens is GDP has now fallen by 10. Sector A has saved, accumulated 10 of the dollars that are in existence. But those $10 have come from sectors B and C. So they've dis-saved. And you've now got GDP of 590, it's fallen by 10. And savings is still 0. What did B and C also decide to save? Well, they spend now 190 each. Their expenditure falls by 30. The income of the other sectors also falls by 30. So GDP is now 570. Aggregate savings is still zero. Nobody saved any money. But of course we all try to save money, don't we? Again, I'm quoting this little bloke called Carl from the 1870s, and he's saying, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. And he's true. Some of us enjoy wasting money, okay, but most of us, if asked, would say we'd like to save money. We're all trying to accumulate. And not just, we can accumulate bottles, okay? We can all have a positive stock of bottles. What I'm talking is financial accumulation, the amount of money we have in bank accounts. We're all trying to accumulate positive money. But whole economies can't save unless there's some mystery sector that spends more than it earns. So I'm going to whack in an extra sector here. I'm going to call it sector question mark. And now I've got a bit of extra spending going on. So sector A is spending 220, 100 on B, 100 on C, and 20 on sector question mark. And so sector B and so sector C. And then sector C, sector question mark, which is getting 60 in, is actually spending 90. So therefore it's losing £30 a year. It's spending 30 on each of sectors A, B and C and getting only 20 back. And if it does that, then each of sectors A, B and C can save 10. They can all achieve what they're trying to achieve. So what can sector question mark be? Well, it could be banks. Okay, banks can lend out more than they get back in repayments. They can lend out 30 and they can get 20 in repayments plus interest. That's quite possible. But if they do that, that increases your bank accounts by 30, but it also increases your debt by 30. You have no net increase in your money. Okay? Your net position doesn't change if you borrow from banks. But if the government spends more than it gets back in taxation, if it spends that money on you, that doesn't give you an identical tax obligation at a later stage, unless you're Puerto Rican. If you see what Donald Trump is saying about any aid to Puerto Rico right now must be repaid later. But in the real world, when the government spends, it doesn't give you an obligation to repay that money. So you get an increase in money without getting an increase in obligation. You've got to pay taxes, but they're not equivalent. Okay? So what that means is you get a net increase in your financial assets if the government persistently spends more than it taxes. Now where does it get the money from? That's always the big question. Where are you going to find the money? You print it. You don't actually have to put it on pieces of paper these days. You put it in bank accounts. But and legal rules stop the government doing this directly. But indirectly, a government with its own central bank, and please do not get rid of your central bank. I don't care how bad they are. Don't shut it down. Don't make it a branch of the European Central Bank. Please. Okay? For your own benefit. Any government with its own treasury and its own central bank ultimately can do this through open market operations. So remember I had the government spending 30 more than it earned now. What I have it doing is it sells bonds worth 33. And by selling the bonds to the central bank puts a deposit. I'm now showing liabilities and assets as negative, which is a convention I use in Minsky. That's 33 pounds in this case that the Treasury can spend on the public. So it spends that 30 and the money turns up in the reserves of the private banks, and then with 3 of it, it pays interest to the central bank. In the private banks now, they get the 30 coming in from the government because that's money being deposited in your bank account. Sectors A, B and C get that money. The accounting is perfect. And notice what's happening because, I'll go back one thing. The paying interest, the government paying interest increases the equity of the central bank. Okay? There's no problem in paying that equity. Now if the government does the opposite and tries to run a surplus, then what I've got it here is it's running a surplus of 30. It's spending 20, it's getting tax revenue of 20 from each sector, it's only spending 10 back. What happens to the other sectors? Your bank accounts fall by 10 each. So the government running a surplus causes you to run a deficit. Does that sound like a good idea anymore? I hope not. Okay. And that's often why we get private debt bubbles. Not a causal link, but there's two ways you can react to this. You've got less money in your bank account, you can spend less, GDP falls. Or you can go borrow money from the banks and spend it. And the banks are quite happy to lend that money because they get more of a claim on your assets if they have collateralised debt. So what you get is that rising level of debt I've shown you beforehand, and this is what's being ignored by the mainstream because they model capitalism as if it's a barter system, which it's clearly not. So they've ignored this phenomenon. This is the UK and the USA. And even the Great Depression, even when deflation gave us this huge increase in the debt ratio, the level of debt we've got now is higher than it was back at the Great Depression. So mainstream economics has ignored this huge increase in debt because they start from the assumption it doesn't matter, therefore we can ignore it. That's like assuming that the sunshine doesn't matter, so you can go walking naked in the Sahara Desert and you won't die of either thirst or cancer. You'll die of both. It's a question of which one kills you first. They're ignoring what matters. Now, looking at the United States, the reason they had a boom for so long before the crisis hit was for every year from 1950 on, actually earlier than that, credit was positive. The change in private debt was greater than zero until the crisis hit, and then it went negative as it did back in the Great Depression, giving you a rising level of private debt and then a peak after the crisis and a decline. So that's the trap the West has got itself stuck in. I'm happy to say Poland's not there yet, but the word yet still has relevance. This is now your chart for debt and credit. And your private debt level is substantially lower than America, as you can see. You're still below 100% of GDP, actually below 90% of GDP, but you have risen from 20% back in 1996. So your trend indicates you could have trouble in the future. You're still below the trouble level overall. Now this is credit, always positive. A dip, I imagine you had a recession back then. Okay. Then a boom, then another recession, then you recovered. Okay. But you've still got a rising level of credit, rising level of private debt. At some stage you could have a crisis coming out of that. And this is what worries me. I know that the figure the government's obsessing about is the red line, which is government debt. When you hit the 60% level, and this actually, I hadn't noticed that before, you really did flat line. Was that government policy back then as well? Okay. So you imposed it in a very rigid way. You continued having a booming economy because the private sector continued borrowing. If you repeat the same process, it's quite possible you could drive the private sector into another bubble, a property bubble, which would then give you a boom until your economy collapsed and you join the West in understanding that capitalism, even though it's better than socialism, ain't perfect. Now, often people like myself who criticise economic theory are taken as being critics of capitalism. I'm a great fan of entrepreneurship and the innovative pressure that capitalism gives us, but I'm a critic of ignoring that and believing it's a system that gives you equilibrium. And part of what I've done as well as writing critiques and trying to make them fun to read, I've also written a cartoon book with a brilliant cartoonist called Miguel Guerra. We haven't actually published it yet, but it's called Econ Comics, Taking the Con Out of Economics, and sends up economists, and that's me injecting a reality virus into economic theory. Now, if anything deserves to get a disease because of realism, it's economic theory. Let's get there. And thank you to Marcina and colleagues for translating my book into Polish. Thank you. Yeah. Oh yeah. So I've got one little thing I've mentioned down the bottom here, which is the university sector has been ruined by economic theory because economists have driven an attempt to turn the universities into marketplaces. And the thing about a marketplace is I'm getting sick of my Apple phone. Okay, it doesn't ring. I don't know why. It stopped ringing. It turns off its Wi-Fi all the time. This keeps on going. My next phone's going to be a Samsung again. This is about my third or fourth Apple. I've had 2 or 3 Samsungs. Okay. How many university degrees do students have before they go to university? 0. They're uninformed. They cannot possibly know about universities. If you want to have a marketplace, you need to have informed consumers. But economic theory said everything's better if we can draw this for supply and demand, everything's going to be better. So what they did, they deregulated student numbers. Said the university can't control how many students there are in first year. They can just have as many places as they like. Well, that destroyed my university in Australia because my university was low ranking. The number of students applying to enrol went from 120 to 16 in 1 year. My department was shut down. The same thing's happened in England. I've had enough of it and enough of bureaucrats running universities as well. So I'm actually going for crowdfunding and using a thing called Patreon, which is here. And I'm going to be publicly funded to continue doing what I'm doing right now without the hassle of having to put up with university bureaucrats or government bureaucrats who think everything is better if you turn it into a marketplace. So this is a bit like Kickstarter, only it's continuous funding, as little as $1 a month. That's the minimum amount anybody can pay for it. At the moment I'm getting about $5,000 US a month, which would be a lot in Poland. It's barely livable in London, but hopefully enough to continue being an agitator for economic change in London. So if anybody wants to help out, I'd be most appreciative. And that's the website for Patreon is there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for a great talk. And I think I'll open the floor now for the questions. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and then I'll give you a voice.
Always takes one person to have the courage. Here we go.
My question is that the simulations that you showed with also the declining shares of income for the workers, did you also try kind of limits with, how do you say it, with
A basic income? Or?
No, not basic income, but where workers go to the streets and kind of claim ground again. I mean, in real life, there is a kind of certain existential threshold where kind of systems tend to collapse, not because of credit crunches or this financial crisis which we have seen, but because people go to the streets and claim livable conditions again. Have you been to get close to this kind of?
That tends to happen in socialist economies which become capitalist, not in capitalist economies themselves. So the last time it actually happened in a massive way in capitalism was in the 1970s, when there was a real boom, a genuine boom going on, and workers were marching in the streets demanding wage rises because inflation was high. Inflation was high because of a wage price spiral and because of increasing raw materials costs, because the oil price rises and so on. And they got their wage rises, but they then found that was wiped out through price rises as well. And in fact, 1973, when you take a look at it using the empirical data that I've assembled from central banks around the world, 1973 was the first major debt bubble and burst. And when the debt bubble burst, then that took the bargaining power away from workers because unemployment rose quite dramatically. In Australia's case, which of course is where I was living at the time, unemployment in 1973 rose from 1% to 5%. Well, that completely eliminated the power of workers to bargain. But you look at the socialist system, which of course you all came from, this is this is ground zero for the revolt against socialism and the Soviet state system. You always had full employment. It wasn't very good work, as one of my colleagues said, a Polish colleague, we pretended to work and they pretended to pay us. But you then had the demand, the Lech Walesa, the campaigning, that happened here, but you had the full employment as a background. When you have unemployment and you have no income or a lousy income as a basis, you get tamed. And so workers have not gone on demanding wage rises in that situation. If you're going to get it, I think you need something like a basic income or a job guarantee, and you do that through the ballot box. It's not going to happen through strikes and campaigns by workers in the street.
I have a question.
Speak up, yeah.
I have a question about the core handbook that referring to the coming handbook that textbook that came.
Oh yeah, the core textbook. Yeah.
I actually wanted to use it in my classes.
Yeah.
Students, And I also advertised it to some people because I think it's much better than the old ones, the mainstream ones. How much of a mistake am I doing?
You're not making as big a mistake as using ManQ. Okay, ManQ is much worse. But it's the same old stuff. It's just better packaged. I mean, you've got to take your hat off to the Neoclassicals because since they share a paradigm, it's very easy for them to get together. Right, we have to have demand curves, we have to have supply curves, we need indifference curves, we need a bit about rationality, we need this, we need that. They can package it all together. That was funded by the Institute for New Economic Thinking.
Yeah.
And there was a separate group headed by Robert Skidelsky, which is non-orthodox. Now, Robert, unlike me, I like Robert, we get on well, but Robert's a critic of mathematics. He literally, viscerally reacts against mathematics turning up. He doesn't want mathematics in anything he puts together. I want mathematics. It means we fight. We don't actually produce anything. So Skidelsky's team never came out with a textbook, whereas the core group got together and they produced the textbook, and the motto for the textbook was, economics as if the last 30 years has happened. Now, that's an abridged version. The real thing is economics as if the first 30 years of neoclassical economics research has happened. So they include game theory, and they include asymmetric information, etc., which makes it more interesting. But it doesn't.
It's a little bit more,
Pardon?
think, historically driven. Yeah?
Pardon?
It's a little bit more historically driven by economic history. It starts with economic history.
Yeah, it starts with economic history, but it sees it through a neoclassical lens. If you want to get a book which actually has more realistic micro, get this man's book, Wolfram Eisner. And Wolfram, have you got a copy of your book there or not?
Oh, yes.
Wave it around.
I always have it day and night with me. No, I brought one copy for here, for our school. It's a Macroeconomics of Complex Economy, pluralistic approach, evolutionary, institutional, neoclassical, and complexity perspectives. Elsevier Academic Press last year. End of commercial break.
There you go.
Thanks.
But so there is an alternative, and it's a complex systems approach. If you want to do it for micro, seriously, use Wolfram's text. Okay. To me, the core text is a bit like Paul Krugman. He's a left winger you have when you're not being left wing. Okay. There's an Australian commercial which is you wouldn't know. There's a drink called Clayton's come out in Australia, and Clayton's has no alcohol. So the advertisement for us is it's a drink you're having when you're not having a drink. Well, the core textbook is the heterodox textbook you have when you're not getting anything heterodox. And like I was in a seminar or a speech at Manchester University with Wendy Carlin, first time we met. And we're getting on better since our first meeting, I might say. But Wendy was asked a question from the audience about, what about post-Keynesian economics? And Wendy's reaction, and I quote, was, look, I find it really strange going back to all this schools of economic thought stuff because the economy's changed so much since Keynes's time. And she thought what post-Keynesian meant is stuff Keynes wrote after he wrote the general theory. It's not. It's stuff which people wrote because they thought the mainstream completely misinterpreted Keynes. So she wasn't even aware that there was an alternative school of thought. Now that's partly the trouble of orthodox people doing something like this. They don't read our literature. For example, my paper on modelling Minsky's financial instability hypothesis was published in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. They wouldn't even have known where that was on library shelves. Okay? Now, at the same time, I've read hundreds, probably thousands of articles in the Economic Journal, the American Economic Review, the Journal of Economic Theory, etc. If you're non-orthodox, you have to read the orthodoxy. But if you're orthodox, you don't even know the non-orthodox exists. So they're very, very poor for showing alternative thoughts. And they still have rising marginal cost. There's not a single empirical fact in their model of how firms behave. It's all based on, imagine you're producing lemonade on a street corner, okay? And lemons, you've got to use less, your capacity to chop the lemons falls as you chop more lemons. That sort of stuff. Why do you find no empirical data in those micro textbooks? And this is based on surveys of students, experiments and so on. It's because the empirical data contradicts their theories. So, try something else. Good question.
relationship between this economic foundation of macroeconomics or macro-founded models and some alternative micro complexity, agent-based stuff. Do you think it's just enough, like starting from this identity definitions of relations and then build up models, or it's so difficult for me to think about the connection between these different levels and whether there is a way to integrate them in a coherent, not dualistic way of understanding economics, or it's just about structural logic and microphenomena, two kinds of science which are not actually.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think economics has always had this belief you've got to derive stuff from the individual and aggregate. If you go back to look at Adam Smith, that's a large part of his own thinking, with this idea of take what we know about individuals and extrapolate. And if you look at genuine sciences, no genuine science, like to take thermodynamics, didn't ask, how does an individual atom feel? It is just atoms are atoms that molecules bounce into each other in the air here. We've got the state of thermodynamic equilibrium, roughly speaking, and it's the aggregate that's looked at rather than the individual particles. Then only when you get to the stage where you've got to look at energy coming in from the outside or boundary conditions, because the molecules aren't bumping into other molecules, they're bumping into walls and windows, and you change it, then you start doing your micro modelling and saying, well, how do these individual atoms operate if some of them are hitting other atoms but others are hitting walls? And then you have a multi-agent approach at that level. I think we should do the same thing. So I'm happy to start working from definitions at the macro level and drill down. But for example, if I get to finance markets, then yes, I'm going to have funding coming in to affect the finance markets, but I'm going to have bulls and bears. And the bulls have different attitudes to share directions than the bears do. And you have leverage positions and short squeezes and short sells and so on. At that level, the multi-agent stuff works extremely well. I would not want to try to simulate the stock market using my macro down stuff. But I would like to do it with multiple agents influenced by funds coming in from leverage positions and see how the agents operate and get the volatility that way. So I think it's a case of start from the macro, and then when you get to a point where you can't get any deeper at the macro point, then embed a multi-agent in that perspective. The difficulty I see with multi-agent work, and I'm speaking from colleagues who are doing it, one of my best ever PhD student, one of my two best ever PhD students is currently doing a PhD in a multi-agent model at the emergence of trade. He's doing a multi-agent thesis on the emergence of trade. Yeah. How does trade evolve? Brilliant work. I want to get him in position, by the way. We should have a chat about this later. But Tim began with the intention of building a model of Minsky, the financial instability hypothesis. He began that 3 years ago. Then he realised he could actually build the model that did this in NetLogo, but it was so complicated that trying to work out what the hell was going on was virtually impossible. So when he realised he had to pull right back and just consider, how does trade evolve? And what he's looking at is what happens when you have money versus not money. What happens when you measure wealth in terms of money versus money plus goods? And then the whole thesis is about that. And it's a brilliant thesis. But reaching the point of reaching Minsky, rather than getting it done in 3 years of full-time research, it might take him 30 years of full-time research. We haven't got 30 years. So in that sense, the system dynamics top-down approach can get to stuff much faster. Multi-agent's got such an enormous overhead, first of all, in coding. You've got to become really proficient at computer coding, and most economists are shithouse at computer coding. I'm talking as somebody, I used to do computer software design, I still do computer software design, and I used to review computer software. I did write it at one stage. And then huge overhead compared to even mathematics. So that intellectual effort you have to devote to coding tends to overwhelm what you've got left to do at the economics. So I see lots of drawbacks in seeing it as the way to go. I'm quite happy to have it as a companion to the top-down stuff, but I think if we make it the foundation, and try to do everything there, we'll never get anywhere. And what will happen? Neoclassical will come on. Oh, let's just assume utility maximising behaviour. Let's just assume we'll be back in the same old trap again. But I'm not ruling it out. But I think it, given a minor role within an overall context defined by top-down modelling, which is structural and which works from macroeconomic definitions.
Martin, you had a question.
Yeah. In your book, very often you are criticizing the neoclassical theory for having unrealistic assumptions.
Yeah.
And you are using the typology of Musgrave typology of assumption in economic theory. But I think that the same can be said about other school of economic thought. For example, post-Keynesian in Kalecki's model, he's assuming that all workers are spending all their wages, and it's clearly unrealistic, especially today, when actually not only they don't spend everything, they spend more than they receive in wages, because they go into debt. So what is the difference between neoclassical unrealistic assumption and post-Keynesian?
It's largely the fact that it's put up in equilibrium terms versus non-equilibrium. Me, Janos Kornai got it right in the very first instance, and so did Fisher before him. The mistake is enforcing equilibrium on everything. That's the major assumption. If you assume everything happens in equilibrium, you leave out the genuine nature of complex systems, the non-equilibrium systems. I'll just bring up my favourite. The obvious one is the Lorenz system. The Lorenz model is the simplest possible model of turbulence. It has three equations to it. A rate of change of the x and y displacement, literally like the position of a drop of water on a hot plate, so the x position and the y position there, and the temperature gradient. And the reason it was built by Lorenz back in the 1960s was, at the time, meteorologists used linear models. And he said, well, we know the main forces in the weather are non-linear. So he built the simplest possible non-linear model by taking the extremely complicated, I think they're 11-dimensional Navier-Stokes equations, a particular form of Navier-Stokes, and deriving it down to three, rather than partial differential, ordinary differential equations. And when he simulated, this is the sort of behaviour it gets. It's a non-equilibrium system. So the main difference is assuming equilibrium. And that's why I'm critical even of post-Keynesians, like good colleagues like Mark Lavoie and co, who build stock flow consistent models that have equilibrium, where they force the parameters to be such that they reach equilibrium and they're shocked. I think they're making 70% of the mistakes the neoclassicals do by forcing equilibrium. We need to think in non-equilibrium terms.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I also have another question, but I just wanted to...
You speak up, yeah.
I had another question, but first I wanted to remind, if in terms of gender parity, if maybe some woman in this room wants to ask a question. You don't like this idea?
No, it's just like, if any wanted to, I would assume that she already would.
No, that's kind of the male...
Is anybody holding back on that front, or...?
You can continue.
Otherwise, I just...
That's actually a good point to raise a question about pluralism, and I'm happy to go from this point on. I'm talking about mathematical modelling, macroeconomic modelling, and larger sense post-Keynesian or complex systems behaviour. But part of the pluralism movement is to say we should have lots and lots of approaches to economics. We should have feminist, ecological, etc., etc. And I know there's a certain tendency to say, well, ultimately we should also have to come and have one approach to economics, like we have physics has one approach to physics. Well, that's bullshit, because physics, Physica, the major journal in physics is called Physica. There's Physica A, B, C, D, and E. Okay? I get published in Physica A because that's the journal of interdisciplinary physics. But there's one devoted to thermodynamics, there's one to nuclear physics. Okay? There's multiple facets to physics, just like there are multiple facets to economics. So even though I think we should get an overall coherent theme, which is a bit like quantum mechanics coming along, or relativity, and giving us a core to economic theory, and that would largely come out of complexity. We also need people to say, well, they have to focus upon feminist issues, racist issues, which clearly have an impact upon the economy. Clearly things we're leaving out. So there's a range, even once we get a new coherent economics, where rather than their classical core being the core, there's still a range for those other approaches, including feminist economics, has to have a role.
The question, do you understand me in the back? My question is, the things that you outlined, they seem quite very plausible. If you utter them, for instance, in terms of policy discussions in England, what is kind of going on, you kind of get counter answers that you're not a proper mainstream professor of high reputation, and so your propositions are flawed. Or do you get kind of plausible arguments which kind of also go to your contents and frame them in another way? Or how is actually the debate going on if you utter kind of a position which is in counter to such conservative positions?
For example, the major fact that I've got debating now is this whole idea of should the government run a surplus? This whole issue of the government not being able to spend the money, there's no magic money tree. And if this is when we had the election going on and Theresa May was trying to defend austerity against Corbyn's attack and saying we want to have a balanced budget rather than trying to run a surplus, she said to a nurse who was saying, I've got to go to food banks to survive, she said to that nurse, there's no magic money tree. And Theresa May was right. There are two magic money trees. The banks create money out of nothing using double entry bookkeeping, and the government creates it. Okay? Now, if the government doesn't create it using its magic money tree, the only magic money tree left is the banking sector, unless you have a third magic money tree, which is called the European Union if you're Germany. Okay, you lock these countries into running trade deficits with you, so they produce your money. So there's actually 2.5, or maybe 2.1 magic money trees, because the maximum you can expect to get is about a 10% trade surplus before you have the Third World War break out. So there are 2.1 magic money trees. Okay? So what I find is, to actually get it through to people, you have to use something nobody can argue with. And this is the difficulty. If you dive in and accept the mainstream position about sound finance, you lost straight away. Okay? So what I've got, that's why I'm using numerical examples here. It's very hard it's easy for people to ignore algebra because then you have what's called the Migo effect. Ever heard of that? My eyes glaze over. Okay? People look at algebra and 5% of the audience will understand it and 95% start considering whether they should start snoring or not. Okay? But if you use numbers like I'm using here, virtually anybody who's going to be in an audience can understand numbers. When you put it up like this and say, well, in fact, the government borrowing money is actually the government telling the central bank to accept pieces of paper off it, which are bonds, in return for other pieces of paper, which are bank entries. And if the government runs a deficit, then what it does, it increases the equity of the central bank. And so I hope, working at a very simple level, I can demolish those arguments. But it's incredible how much this presumptions we have about responsible behaviour at the individual level affect how we think about the macro. It's one reason I want to get away from micro. Okay? Because when people think in micro terms, they say, well, I save money, therefore shouldn't the government save money? And if the government saves, that'll mean I've got saved. No, it doesn't. It means the exact opposite. You've got to see it in the interlocking sense that a real economy is. So that's what I try to do. But it ain't easy, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm a woman and I'm
Speak up, sir. Yeah.
Thank you for your remark on gender equality. I think it's important also, like in economy especially. So I also do research on investing in care economics, and we use multipliers. So it's not even that government is not, it's saving £10, let's say, but it's without investment, we have also induced effect, not only direct impact, but also induced an indirect
That's
impact.
Right.
So it means that actually the loss to the society is much bigger than this £10 not invested.
Exactly.
So Yeah. So of course I like your simplified model. I think it's also clear for people to understand.
Yeah.
But I think
it's worse.
Really, it's much worse.
Yeah.
So
what I'm leaving out.
Employment in terms of also
infrastructure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also social infrastructure, as we say.
Yeah. Well, the simplest thing, what I've got here effectively is there's 600. I've got a model where there's 300 pounds in the economy turning over twice per year, and then one sector tries to save more money, so they save 10, but the others are still spending at the same rate. And of course, if one sector tries to save, then the other sectors are going to slow down how fast they spend. So you're going to get a decline in the turnover of money as well as that hoarding effect by one sector. So it will be worse. And then, of course, once you've done it, you suddenly don't have the resources. You don't create them. So you put up buildings that have flammable cladding on the outside because you save money, and then you burn people to death and destroy resources. If you'd put the money in, you wouldn't have the problem in the first place. You build the technology. If you decide not to invest, you don't have high-speed transportation anymore. You don't enable people to meet up from different cities to build new concepts. So you actually reduce your investment. And this whole idea, this savings, the Swabian housewife that Merkel has popularised, is actually a way of going back to the Stone Age.
Exactly.
So it's worse than I make it out in this model.
And it's also like, if we are a deficit country like Poland, like according to the Varoufakis' new book, so then we have really no choice than to borrow the money and also to invest in the economy, because we would never be surplus country like Germany.
Yeah, and see, the whole focus, if you think about what neoclassical economics does, it makes you focus upon specialisation and trade. But in fact, what gives you growth is innovation and investment. And if we change our mindset to get away from the obsession on trade, but to focus on the need for investment and innovation, it's a question of how do we finance it. And that's, that is the secret that lets countries like South Korea and Japan do what they've done. They ran trade surpluses as well, quite deliberately. But that all meant they were getting investment funds and they were reinvesting and growing. And that's what we have to see as our mindset, again, within the framework of an ecological issue as well, we haven't even raised here. But yeah, it's as much as going from the Ptolemaic vision of the world as the universe centered on the Earth and planets and stars revolving around us to the other way around. It's a huge shift. If we don't make it, then we're going to be doing two things. We're going to be hitting stagnation as we stumble into an ecological crisis.
I didn't want to go off that more practical and policy relevant discussion. I mean, I'm inclined to tell something as a German, of course, about the Eurozone and liberating countries from it. I was one of those who always advocated since many, many years for Greece to get out of it.
Yeah.
But still, countries in Europe step into jail voluntarily. So that would be a part of the discussion. I have another question. As you showed the Lorenz strange attractor again, and you are working and arguing in the frame of macro models. My question would be, I mean, the computer calculates, and if we would take a little calculation a sequence, we could calculate it, of course. We take in some parameter numbers and start calculating, and we see how the outcome values evolve, right? Mm-hmm. That is obvious. I mean, you have a 3-equation system.
Yeah.
It's non-linear, and you probably, that was my question, would you think 100% of the math and the algebra of why the system goes into that strange attractor? The macro foundation discussion that I would think I would oppose to your
macro,
to your purely macro.
I think what you do,
purely macro.
I think what you do is micro versus meta.
Yeah, well, of course, yes. I like the meso.
So, for example,
I've written a lot about meso. Yes, definitely.
Meso level. My favourite instance of this is actually water. This commonest substance on the planet. We take it for granted. If you wanted to understand the properties of water by understanding the properties of a single molecule of H2O, you couldn't do it. Because a single molecule of H2O cannot be water, it cannot be ice, it cannot be steam, and it certainly can't be snow. Okay? So how do we get those characteristics? It's out of the interactions of them. But then you look at it and say, what is it about that particular molecule that gives it all the peculiarities, that it forms a liquid at certain temperatures and ice below that? It's actually the opposite of many other substances. Ice floats. If you have liquid iron and solid iron, the solid iron will fall to the bottom. Okay? It won't float to the top. But liquid water and solid water, the solid water floats to the top, the liquid goes to the bottom. The planet would be totally different if it had different properties. To understand them, you've got to look at what's actually going on at the quantum level in the interactions between H2O molecules. So you need to get at a very deep level to understand those interactions, and a similar thing applies.
Yeah, but at which level of the system water are we now? Are we at the micro level or at the macro?
We're at the macro level. I think to understand it, we've got to work at the macro level first and see what its properties are, because again, Lorenz's equations there are very much at the macro level. Those are the equations which became the foundation of modern meteorology. And if you look at how accurately they were able to predict the courses of those last three cyclones. The one that we knew was going to hit Florida. Unfortunately, it didn't hit Mar-a-Lago. I was hoping it would. Hit the other side of Florida. The one that went back out into the ocean again but devastated Puerto Rico. The mathematical models of those behaviours began with Lorenz's models. We began with Lorenz's mathematical equations, these equations. Meteorologists tell me they're still stuffing up like crazy. The meteorologists are incredibly critical of their own discipline and saying we're not complete, we have mistakes, the models aren't good enough, etc., etc. They're a damn sight better than they were 40 years ago. When it began from acknowledging that the system is non-linear and out of equilibrium. So I think we can go a long way with economists simply accepting that and moving forward and seeing what happens, rather than worrying about should we start from micro, should we start from macro. But I think to begin it, you have to work at the structure of the economy and you have to start from non-equilibrium. And doing that gets you a hell of a long way.
Yeah, part of the structure of the economy in socioeconomic systems is social institutions, for instance, which have been learned and be either solutions of certain defined problems, collective ones.
But the major one alone is where we earn our incomes from. The neoclassical economics leaves that income distribution. When you do a model of consumers, you're not saying as a consumer, a capitalist or a worker, just a consumer. You've eliminated social classes, which are probably the major institution in which we live. How you earn your income is the major institution of life. I earn mine by working for a wage. I'm about to earn it by public donation, which is great. Okay, I got sick of earning it for managers. Others earn by entrepreneurs. Others earn by inheriting large amounts of money. The L'Oreal heiress who just died recently. All these, that's the fundamental social institution. It's what Marx and the classical school got right. You've got to start, you can't abolish it. We abolished looking at a particular institution. Look where it got us. So the social institutions matter. And what you do is you add those institutions in. So Minsky's been designed not just to model this worker capitalist banker stuff I've shown you, but to model banks themselves and model the government as another institution. And you bring the institutions in and then say, how do they affect a stylized simulation of what you're talking about? I think we can get there. But we have to start from realising that it's necessary. A huge part of what neoclassical economics does is say, let's forget about institutions and forget about interpersonal relations and just model from isolated individuals. You can't model capitalism, you can't model any social system that way. There is no such thing as Robinson Crusoe. But that's the myth they got us to start with, and that's still the myth that turns up in the core textbook as well, I think.
I still think it's a hen-egg problem. I mean, institutions have emerged in a process.
Yeah.
Not from a representative individual, from many heterogeneous individuals.
Yeah. Well, that's where the multi-agent stuff does matter, because you can see forms of.
Yeah, sure. But of course, you can stop an ongoing historical process in the real world, saying, okay, I stop here. I model the macro level and I look what it generates in terms of complex systemic behavior, and then perhaps I consider the downward causation. You could also say I start from the structures of the micro level, look what emerges on the systemic level, and then look back down. Up and down.
And we now have the technology.
So perhaps we are not. I mean, I would say your evocation of a pure macro perspective is not sufficient. I mean, we need for explaining, for instance, attractors in socioeconomic systems. We need to go into what interactions are taking place and what institutions come about.
I'm willing to say I'm going to get 90% of the way there by working from the macro level, but you also need technology which will let you combine macro and micro, and that's developing in software. There is a package called AnyLogic, which another PhD student of mine is using to model Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and that combines system dynamics with multi-agent. And so what you could do is have like a built-in model of the finance sector, have stock markets, and then in the stock markets have multi-agent behaviour where you have people differing in how, what their behaviour is, or what strategy do they use, have them evolve a set of strategies. And then that gives you signals that come out at the price of capital assets, which would feed into the rest of the economy. So the technology is being built to do that, but I think its foundation has to be the systemic first, and then the agent interaction second.
Okay, my turn. I had two questions, one technical, one concerning the model.
Yeah.
First of all, is it possible to broaden it to incorporate case of two countries, not just macro level of one country, not only to model trade, but also is it possible to model financial contagions or something like this?
Yeah.
Or from the other side, is it possible to incorporate heterogeneity of agents, because you mentioned some possibilities? My second question was, what is your personal opinion on monetary integration, but to some extent it was...
Monetary integration?
Monetary integration.
On the first question, Minsky's been designed to give you the capacity to model financial flows. So, like in this particular model, which is a model of how neoclassicals think banks operate, I first of all built the model from the point of view of the banking sector. So, this particular model has banks having reserves which are deposited by consumer sector or investment sector by workers, and then there's the bank equity as well, and I then have lending being between a consumer agent and an investment agent. But having defined that, Minsky automatically fills in the other, seeing the system from the point of view of the consumer sector. So what was the liability for the bank, which is the deposit accounts of the consumer sector, become an asset over here. And what's done by Minsky in the background is it develops the differential equations that show you all this logic. So if I go down the bottom here, I've got the dynamics between workers. I'll actually have to page down a bit there, I think, to see it. Let's see. Okay. So that builds all the differential equations for those dynamics. Now I know those equations are consistent because I entered them through the tables over here. So the structure of these models of the different sectors lets me build complicated differential equation models of interactions between sectors where I know they're going to be right. Okay? My assumptions about the behaviour might be wrong, but I know the structural equations are going to be correct. So the intention is to do exactly the same thing with multiple sectors. Once you define a scalar model of the economy, then you can say, I want 30 sectors, bang, it'll build the mathematics for you. And then equally is international trade. I built a model of a single economy. I want to model multiple economies. Then how many economies do you want? Do you want 4? Do you want 20? And then Minsky will build all those equations for you. I haven't yet been able to do that because it takes money to pay a programmer to do that, but that's the next intention, to get to the stage where you can clone an entire economy, and then you have exports and imports, monetary flows, capital ownership, etc., etc. And then we could finally have a decent model of international trade, which at the moment we do not have. The neoclassical model is nonsense of international trade, but it has to be dynamic, has to be monetary, has to be non-equilibrium. So all that is possible, but it takes coding, it takes time to do that. So I'm going to be applying for funding to get that done from the what's called the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK. But I'd be happier getting it from the public because, frankly, the public is more willing to fund that sort of stuff than government bodies are. But yeah, that is quite feasible. But the second, monetary union. Monetary diversity makes more sense than monetary union. If you have monetary union, what you say is, we're going to centralise, have a single central bank, and we're not going to be able to devalue against different sectors of this huge economy we call Europe. Now, that would only work if Europe was booming all the time. But actually what's happened at a monetary union, first of all, you can't devalue against the Germans anymore, but the Germans have got a lower inflation rate because they forced their workers to accept lower wage rises. But consequently, Germany's had a 1% rate of inflation for the last 15 years. Italy's had a 3% rate of inflation. I mean, every year, German firms are gaining a 2% advantage over Italian firms. And that could be sustainable if there was then a taxation flow, meaning Italy got in tax revenue what it lost in trade revenue, but it doesn't. So in fact it's disastrous. What it means is, like if I go back to whenever I travel to a country, I go back and check in a drawer in my house and see, have I got any of its currency? This is my last set of Polish notes from the last time I was here. That's a pain. So we find it inconvenient at the individual level to have this diversity of currencies. But we have our economy and our transaction systems are regional, are localised, and frankly it'd be better to have more of these rather than less. It's reducing the cost of transferring them from one currency to the other that matters more than having a monetary union.
All right, so we have 2 more questions, and I think that then we're going to finish.
Yes, so I have a question about financialization and how this new dynamic of growth of financial sector forces us to rethink our economic models, and not only neoclassical models but also post-Keynesian models. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but even in the Minsky model, you have investment that drives debt and the debt production, and so the causal relationship goes from investment that drives the finance industry. And well, my difficulty with this view is that well, you can see that the financial sector has grown somewhat independent, and it's no longer dependent on the investment driving it, actually. And so, how does the dynamic change when the financial sector becomes a more self-referential, and it ceases to be a servant of investment, but actually becomes the end of the finance itself?
Yeah, another great quote from Marx. By the way, the labour theory value is garbage. And so the idea of socialism coming out of capitalism. So when I'm quoting Marx, I'm leaving out what I regard as the nonsense he came up with. But one thing he said at one stage, the finance is a good servant and a lousy master. And that's very true. When the finance sector is small and it's providing finance for entrepreneurs, finance for working capital for firms, and finance for consumption items which are too easy to us to be able to save them out of our saving, things like houses and cars and so on, and they are truly consumption items, not seen as speculative vehicles, then finance is quite useful. But as finance starts to get bigger and bigger compared to the economy, the growth in the fire sector, as Michael Hudson describes it, and as it's also described in the American flow of funds, it gets from being a servant to a master. And it's an appalling master, because basically it's rentier capitalism. It's the bigger the level of debt, the larger a claim the financial sector has on the physical resources of the economy, but it's actually extremely easy to create money. It's very hard to make goods and services. People say it's really hard to make money. No, it's not. All you need is to be a bank and have double entry bookkeeping. And my favourite example of that was in New Zealand, where a petrol station owner applied for an overdraft, and the bank, he applied for a $100,000 overdraft, and whoever typed the amount, approved the loan, forgot to press the decimal point. And so rather than getting an overdraft of 100,000, he got an overdraft of 10 million. Now there is no other industry where doing 8% less work generates 100 times as much output. Okay? In that sense, it defies the thermodynamic limits that apply to real output. So it's incredibly easy to make money. It's very hard to make a profit or to earn a wage. And what we should be doing is regarding the monetary system in that way and manipulating it to our social interests. So if you want to write off private debt, we should write off private debt. Do it in a way that benefits the rest of the economy. So finance should be the servant, not the master. The trouble is, the bigger the debt level gets, and you can see just how high the debt level is now. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s, which was the golden age of capitalism, in America at that time, the debt level was between 60 and 80% of GDP. All the troubles began when it started exceeding that level, getting towards about the level you guys are at now, by the way. America's first financial crisis was of a substantial scale that actually caused a decline in the debt level occurred in 1973-74. It was there. Okay, that was before OPEC, before the OPEC price rises. So once you get past this level, you start getting to a stage where finance is the master, not the servant, and you have the sort of crisis we saw in the Great Depression and in 2008. So it's easy to stop finance being the master. You just have to write off credit-created money and replace it with fiat-created money, which can be easily done once we realise we have those capabilities. But if you don't do it, you end up in a financial crisis like the globe hit in 2008.
In your book, you criticize...
Speak up, yeah.
Okay, in your book, you criticize the usage of probability theory.
Use of what?
Probability theory.
Yeah.
In economics, because most real-life situation are situation of uncertainty, not of risk, and I agree with this.
Yeah.
But real economic behavior also depends on the future and the expectation of the futures. And probability theory is maybe not ideal, but a way to cope with these problems. Your models are deterministic, so they don't care about this future, about this expectation. Don't you think that it is methodologically a step back?
A bit hard to understand the question, but
the question was about the probability and uncertainty.
Yeah.
Uncertainty, because your models are deterministic.
Yeah.
They don't take...
your models are deterministic. Your models are deterministic. They don't cope with
probability.
With futureless expectations.
With expectations, with future expectations.
Yeah. Probability, this is one area where even non-orthodox economists get themselves stuffed up, because there's two approaches to probability. There's what's called the subjective and objective approach. Okay. And what economists teach is you should use subjective probability, not objective probability. Subjective is what I think the odds are that I'm going to turn over a card in 21 and it's going to be an ace rather than a king. Like if I'm sitting on 12 and I turn over a king, I'm out of the game. If I turn over an ace, I'm still in the game. Okay. The subjective probability is your expectation of what the card is going to be. And if you look at the type of probability that's taught in finance, is that subjective expected value is the subjective expectation of probability. The thing is, when you turn over a card, you either get an ace or a king. Okay, the outcome is objective, and that is the difference between an ergodic and a non-ergodic system. Now, we live in a non-ergodic world, and in mathematical terms, this time distribution and the space distribution are identical in an ergodic system. In the real world, they're non-identical. What actually happens in time is not the same thing as happens in space. So if I turn over, if the odds are the expected value of a card is going to be 7.3, then if I play 1,000,000 games of 21, on average the card's going to be a 7.3. But I play one game of card, it's either going to be an ace or a 10. There's a huge difference. And probability, the subjective use of probability, totally distracts you from the actual outcome. So I think we need to get a form of probability which is based on this more objective form of statistics, non-ergodic probability, if you like, rather than what's been taught to students. I mean, students are told if there's an expected value of 110 and the cost is 100, you should take the gamble. But if there's minus 10 and plus 90, you either get the minus or the positive. You don't get the expected value, you get the actual outcome. And it's hugely distorting to actually use that logic. In fact, if you go back and read von Neumann and Morgenstern and Theory of Games and Economic Behaviour, they warned against using subjective probability. But economists ignored that and used subjective because it was easier. So there's a lot of flaws. There's a reason for saying probability should be used, but we've used the wrong form of probability in economics.
Do you want to follow up? You cannot, if the process is not ergodic, you cannot forecast this process.
I'll need to, sorry, the accents.
Okay. If the process is not ergodic, you cannot forecast the process.
Forecast. So you can, on this way, you don't know.
Yeah, but if you chain, like I've seen some work, I've forgotten where I've seen it recently, but if you chain together a series of probable outcomes and you take the time distribution of most gambles falls to zero. The St. Petersburg paradox turns up that way. So there are ways to cope with that time distribution. We've just used the wrong mathematics for doing it. As if you get the expected value in finance. You don't. You get the outcome of a gamble. I think it's time
about forecasting, particularly when you know the distributions of the system, centrality distribution, size distributions, then you can forecast a lot still.
Yeah.
Which has to do with non-ergodicity, but non-ergodicity doesn't mean we cannot forecast.
Also look at whether systems use probability distributions as well. But they again, what's the time?
The normal ones, more or less.
Pardon?
Normal distributions usually.
Yeah, but they successfully do it because they've got a time distribution they're looking at rather than a space distribution.
Right.
Yeah.
Before we finally wrap up, I'd like to welcome on stage Mrs. Beata Wiatrowska from the City Hall of Poznan, which has actually co-financed this lecture. And she will hand out a souvenir to Steve.
I'm here on behalf of our mayor, Mr. Jacek Jaśkowiak, and I would like to thank you in his name because he couldn't be here today in person. So I have a little gift for you and a letter from our mayor.
It's a beautiful town. I think I probably will keep a copy. It's a small enough book for me to take back in my bag, and I've really enjoyed the architecture here, so we'll hang on to that. Thank you.
Thank you very
much.